Is America an inherently racist country? Now, I think any honest discussion, especially of subjects as big as this, should be broken down into smaller pieces in order to better examine it. And the piece that I want to examine in this video is the US Constitution as it was written in 1787. But first, a message from this video's sponsor, History Hit. The slaves being taken across the Atlantic faced a horrific journey. And a century ago, a British explorer, Sir Ernest Shackleton, faced his own perilous journey at sea. While exploring the Antarctic, his ship, the Endurance, sank into the icy depths, forcing he and his men to survive in the icy wastes until they could be rescued. In January 2022, historian Dan Snow and a crew set sail to the Antarctic to try and find Shackleton's lost ship. And you can watch the course of this journey for yourself in the new documentary series Endurance 22, available exclusively on this video's sponsor, History Hit. History Hit is a streaming platform and podcasting network with thousands of hours of content for you to peruse, ranging from the ancient world to modern conflicts. And if Endurance 2022 doesn't quite sound right for you, well, that's okay, because there's plenty of other content for you to peruse. If you'd like to dive more into the subject of this video, there are several lectures and documentaries about the slave trade and its abolition in the British Empire. History Hit has a special offer for fans of this channel. Click the link down in the description or in the pinned comment below and sign up for History Hit. And if you use the code Casual Historian, you'll get 50% off your first 3 months. And when you do, go ahead and check out Endurance 22 and all the other programs they have available. Thanks again to History Hit for sponsoring Casual Historian, but for now, back to the video. Just as there is this myth of the founders being these infallible beings delivering wisdom from on high, there is a counter-myth claiming that they are all evil, racist slaveholders who designed the Constitution to perpetuate the dominance of themselves and the white race over all others. Now, both of these images are wrong, but I believe the latter of them is more so, and I would say the primary sources and some important secondary sources back me up on this. There are 3 parts of the original Constitution dealing with slavery: the 3/5 Clause, the Slave Trade Clause, and the Fugitive Slave Clause. Now, I've already covered the first of these in a previous video, but here's the short version. It's popularly believed that the 3/5 Clause is about how human the framers of the Constitution believed slaves to be.
Slaveholding states wanted slaves to count toward their population, even though, of course, they could not vote because they were property. States with few slaves argued that slaves shouldn't be counted as people because, just to be clear, none of these dudes were not racist.
But when you read the primary sources on this issue, namely the Federalist Papers and James Madison's notes on the debates of the Constitutional Convention, not once is how human slaves are ever discussed. It was, in its entirety, a political compromise, with anti-slavery factions wanting slaves not counted at all in order to politically weaken slave owners in the future national legislature, and pro-slavery factions wanting them counted as whole persons in order to have more power in the legislature, thereby giving them more power to preserve and expand slavery. The anti-slavery delegates argued that giving slaves representation in Congress without the right to vote only empowers the slave owners, and this reasoning is repeated over and over again in the primary sources. This affirmatively proves that the 3/5 Clause has nothing to do with how human they thought slaves to be. To get the full picture of that, watch the previous video. With that out of the way, let's take on the second part, the Slave Trade Clause, Article 1, Section 9. The migration or importation of such persons as any state now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. You'll notice that the word slavery isn't used here, and if you look up the 3/5 and fugitive slave clauses, you'll find it's missing there as well. Now, I said this in the previous video, but I think it bears repeating here. If the framers and the people of their time were as racist and pro-slavery as the countermyth suggests, why then did they not use the word slave proudly and boldly? The answer is that they were well aware of the hypocrisy of a nation founded on the principle of all men are created equal, permitting slavery. They were ashamed of this hypocrisy. During a debate on the apportionment of representatives in the legislature, New Jersey delegate William Patterson expressed his opposition to counting slaves as part of the population for the purposes of representation, and for the use of the word slave in the Articles of Confederation. He was also against such an indirect encouragement of the slave trade, observing that Congress, in their act relating to the change of the 8th Article of Confederation, had been ashamed to use the term slaves, and had substituted a description. There is another, more minor reason why the word slave wasn't used, and that was because of indentured servants. For those who don't know, indentured servitude, which was practiced still in the late 18th century, was a practice of somebody would sign a contract giving someone else the right to their labor for a number of years in exchange for some kind of compensation. Back in Europe, this was used in order to pay debts. In the New World, the compensation was usually someone paying for a person's transportation to the Americas. Under this situation, the person is contractually obligated to give this other person their labor. Now, a bunch of funny business did go on with indentured servitude, but that's a topic better left for its own video. But once again, just so I'm not misunderstood or taken out of context here, I am saying that this was a very minor reason for the wording of the Constitution this way. But I think for intellectual and historical accuracy's sake, we should mention the fact that this clause did in fact apply to indentured servitude, just for the fullness of clarity. At the Philadelphia Convention, the slave trade was mostly brought up in relation to other clauses, primarily in discussion around congressional representation. Time after time, opponents of counting slaves for representation brought up the horrors of the slave trade, and how counting them would encourage the importation of more slaves, thus forcing more Africans into the inhumane conditions of the slave trade and of slavery itself. Mr. Gouverneur Morris was compelled to declare himself reduced to the dilemma of doing injustice to the southern states or to human nature, and he must therefore do it to the former, for he could never agree to give such encouragement to the slave trade as would be given by allowing them representation for their Negroes. In the first place, as 5 slaves are to be counted as 3 freemen, in the apportionment of representatives, such a clause would leave an encouragement to this traffic. In the second place, slaves weakened one part of the Union, which the other parts were bound to protect. The privilege of importing them was therefore unreasonable. And in the third place, it was inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution and dishonorable to the American character to have such a feature in the Constitution. And right here, in black and white, Luther Martin is making many of the same arguments that I've been making in this and in the 3/5 video. And even after they agreed to the 3/5 compromise, they were constantly finding ways to try and discourage the slave trade. In 2 great points, the hands of the legislature were absolutely tied. The importation of slaves could not be prohibited, exports could not be taxed. If slaves are to be imported, shall not the exports produced by their labor supply a revenue the better to enable the general government to defend their masters? There was so much inequality and unreasonableness in all of this that the people of the northern states could never be reconciled to it. No candid man could undertake to justify it to them. He had hoped that some accommodation would have taken place on this subject, that at least a time would have been limited for the importation of slaves. He never could agree to let them be imported without limitation, and then be represented in the national legislature. You see, anti-slavery delegates wanted to be able to tax exports in order to discourage the slave trade. At that time, most of what the South produced was exported to Europe, where it would be made into textiles and other goods. By taxing exports, the northern states were hoping to place a higher economic price on slave owners, subtly discouraging the practice. Some delegates, such as Gouverneur Morris, tried to get the 3/5 compromise removed by adding the word free before inhabitants. Morris despised slavery so much that he called it a curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. John Dickinson of Delaware proposed that a cap should be placed on representation in order to discourage the importation of slaves, but this was rejected. And many of the delegates didn't just condemn the horrors of the transportation of slaves across the ocean, they also condemned the horrors of domestic slavery. The infernal traffic originated in the avarice of the British merchants. The British government constantly checked the attempts of Virginia to put a stop to it. The present question concerns not the importing states alone, but the whole Union. The evil of having slaves was experienced during the late war. Had slaves been treated as they might have been by the enemy, they would have proved dangerous instruments in their hands, but their folly dealt by the slaves as it did by the Tories. Maryland and Virginia had already prohibited the importation of slaves expressly. North Carolina had done the same in substance. All this would be in vain if South Carolina and Georgia be at liberty to import. The Western people are already calling out for slaves. If they can be got through South Carolina and Georgia, slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the emigration of whites, who really enrich and strengthen a country. They produce the most pernicious effects on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effect, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities. He lamented that some of our Eastern brethren had, from a lust of gain, embarked in this nefarious traffic. As to the states being in possession of the right to import, this was the case with many other rights, now to be properly given up. He held it essential in every point of view that the general government should have power to prevent the increase of slavery. Now, if you're looking for a bad guy at the Constitutional Convention, I should introduce you to Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Debates arose over the threat slavery might pose to national security, with northern states not wanting a central government calling up their militias to put down slave revolts in the South. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney countered that the real threat to national security came from frontiersmen or New England fishermen. At one point in the convention, Pinckney claimed that banning the slave trade was unnecessary. South Carolina can never receive the plan if it prohibits the slave trade. In every proposed extension of the powers of Congress, the state has expressly and watchfully expected that of meddling with the importation of Negroes. If the states be all left at liberty on this subject, South Carolina may perhaps by degrees do of herself what is wished, as Virginia and Maryland have already done. After Mason's tirade on August 22nd, Pinckney claimed that South Carolina might abolish slavery on its own. If slavery be wrong, it is justified by the example of all the world. In all ages, one half of mankind have been slaves. If the southern states were let alone, they will probably themselves stop importations. An attempt to take away the right, as proposed, will produce serious objections to the Constitution. He then went on to express a kind of conspiracy theory, claiming that Virginia wants to ban slaves in order to dominate the domestic slave trade. South Carolina and Georgia cannot do without slaves. As to Virginia, she will gain by stopping the importations. Her slaves will rise in value, and she has more than she wants. It would be unequal to require South Carolina and Georgia to confederate on such unequal terms. He then argued that continuing the trade would benefit the whole Union and not just the states that continued the practice. He contended that the importation of slaves would be for the interest of the whole Union. The more slaves, the more produced to employ the carrying trade, the more consumption also, and the more of this, the more revenue for the common treasury. James Wilson responded to Pinckney's claim that South Carolina and Georgia would abolish the trade on their own fairly soon. If South Carolina and Georgia were themselves disposed to get rid of the importation of slaves in a short time, as has been suggested, they would never refuse to unite because the importation might be prohibited. As the section now stands, all articles imported are to be taxed. Slaves alone are exempt. This is, in fact, a bounty on that article. Other delegates began voicing their opposition to allowing the slave trade to continue without either taxing the importation of them or taxing the exports of the products produced with their labor. After all of this pushback, Pinckney admitted that he didn't believe that South Carolina, of her own volition, would cease the importation of slaves anytime soon. So as you can see, Pinckney sucks, but he gets worse. Do you remember earlier when I said that in the notes on the Federal Convention, that there was no point in which they were talking about how human slaves were? Well, I need to make a correction there. They did talk about it once, and it was by Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. He claimed the value of black labor was only 3/5 that of whites, and therefore they should only be counted as 3/5 when it came to taxation. But when the discussion moved on to political representation, he argued that slaves should be counted in full, because they were just as human as whites. At this point, he got called out on his bullshit, and his motion to count all slaves for apportionment was rejected. You can get the full details of that exchange in the previous video. Before the convention was over, Pinckney had one last parting shot. Originally, the slave trade clause would allow the trade to continue until January 1st, 1800. But a couple days later, Pinckney decided to chime in again, and motions to amend the clause to prolong the slave trade until January 1st, 1808. James Madison himself, a slave owner from Virginia, voiced his opposition to Pinckney's proposal. 20 years will produce all the mischief that can be apprehended from the liberty to import slaves. So long a term will be more dishonorable to the American character than to say nothing about it in the Constitution. In his notes, Madison says, Mr. Gouverneur Morris was for making the clause read at once, the importation of slaves into North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia shall not be prohibited. This, he said, would be most fair, and would avoid the ambiguity by which, under the power with regard to naturalization, the liberty reserved to the states might be defeated. He wished it to be known, also, that this part of the Constitution was a compliance with those states. If the change of language, however, should be objected to by the members from those states, he should not urge it. Basically, he wanted to call out the Deep South states for whom this clause was specifically made. so that everyone knew who to blame when reading it. Unfortunately, this proposal did not go through. After the convention finished, James Madison, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, authored the Federalist Papers, urging the public to support the Constitution's ratification. In two of these, James Madison addressed the continuance of the slave trade. Those who raised so many objections against the new Constitution should never call to mind the defects of that which is to be exchanged for it. It is not necessarily that the former should be perfect. It is sufficient that the latter is more imperfect. Is the importation of slaves permitted by the new Constitution for 20 years? By the old, it is permitted forever. It were doubtless to be wished that the power of prohibiting the importation of slaves had not been postponed until the year 1808, or rather, that it had been suffered to have immediate operation. But it is not difficult to account either for this restriction on the general government, or for the manner in which the whole clause is expressed. It ought to be considered as a great point gained in favor of humanity, that a period of 20 years may terminate forever within those states, a traffic which has so long and so loudly upbraided the barbarism of modern policy, that within that period it will receive a considerable discouragement from the federal government, and may be totally abolished by a concurrence of the few states which continue the unnatural traffic in the prohibitory example which has been given by so great a majority of the Union. Happy would it be for the unfortunate Africans if an equal prospect lay before them of being redeemed from the oppressions of their European brethren. Again, we get remorse at the continuance of the slave trade, but we also get an important insight. The Articles of Confederation had no way of banning the slave trade or slavery at all.
The Articles of Confederation required unanimous support to amend the document. This would have included any changes to the legality of slavery. Had the U.S. stayed under the Articles, slavery couldn't have been abolished, so long as one state wanted to keep it going. Compared to this, the Constitution is quite abolitionist.
Okay, then what about the Fugitive Slave Clause? Well, by looking at all the primary sources, there wasn't really much discussion about the Fugitive Slave Clause at all. I mean, compared to the issues of representation in the slave trade itself, this was a pretty small affair.
No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such.
This is another one of those clauses that technically applies to more than just slaves.
It also applied to the indentured servants, who were contractually obligated to labor for someone else. There's also the situation of convicts. Sentencing a criminal to labor as punishment was not uncommon at the time. Now, none of this, however, should be construed into saying that these provisions weren't about slavery. That was their primary purpose. They just happened to have included other, less common forms of servitude. The primary sources don't say much else. It was more or less just agreed to because if you're going to recognize slaves as legally being property, and one of the purposes of government was to protect property rights, this was the logical conclusion. The most discussion I found was someone asking to remove explicit references to slavery in order to include indentured servants and criminals sentenced to labor.
Now, some of you might be thinking, so what if a long-dead white slave owner says that the parts about slavery weren't entirely about preserving slavery? He's not a reliable source. Well, here's another perspective to consider.
Frederick Douglass. He was born a slave and eventually won his freedom, and spent the rest of his life fighting to abolish slavery and obtain legal equality for blacks in the U.S. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, the very ring bolt in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny. I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny, so indeed I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles, be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost.
He didn't take this narrow-minded view propagated by the countermyth.
Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise, at one time, such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they have contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory.
But for those of you who are thinking that Frederick Douglass might just be some Uncle Tom, He has some very harsh criticisms for the US in the very same speech that these previous quotations came from.
Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false in the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity which is outraged, in the name of liberty which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce, with all of the emphasis I can command, everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just. Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad, it corrupts your politicians at home, it saps the foundation of religion, it makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth.
But here's the thing. He doesn't go around condemning the founders as irredeemable heathens to be damned.
But it is answered in reply to all of this that precisely what I have now denounced is, in fact, guaranteed and sanctioned by the Constitution of the United States. That the right to hold and to hunt slaves is a part of the Constitution framed by the illustrious fathers of this republic. Then I dare to affirm, notwithstanding all I have said before, your fathers stooped, basely stooped. And instead of being the honest men I have before declared them to be, they were the veriest impostors that ever practiced on mankind. This is the inevitable conclusion, and from it there is no escape. But I differ from those who charge this baseness on the framers of the Constitution of the United States. It is a slander upon their memory, at least so I believe.
He says that the current state of slavery in the United States was a result of people not following the principles of the founders rather than a strict adherence to them.
In that instrument I hold, there is neither warrant, license, nor sanction of the hateful thing. But interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. Read its preamble, consider its purpose. Is slavery among them? Is it at the gateway, or is it at the temple? It is neither. While I do not intend to argue this question on the very present occasion, let me ask, if it be not somewhat singular that, if the Constitution were intended to be, by its framers and adopters, a slaveholding instrument, why neither slavery, slaveholding, nor slave can be found in it? Now take the Constitution according to its plain reading, and I defy the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery.
Now, you can take issue with his praises if you want, but the fact is, the US Constitution has been one of the greatest devices ever made by man for the freedom of mankind, and the compromises in it were made in hopes of pursuing a greater good.
He urged strenuously that express security ought to be provided for including slaves in the ratio of representation. He lamented that such a species of property existed. But as it did exist, the holders of it would require this security. It was perceived that the design was entertained by some of excluding slaves altogether. The legislature, therefore, ought not be left at liberty. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, who was morally in agreement with the delegates such as Morris and King, believed that it was important to preserve the Union, and that more good might be done if the 13 states stood together. But the most tragic perception of Sherman is that he believed that slavery was already dying off as an institution, and would wither away as it became more financially unsustainable.
In defense of Roger Sherman, he wasn't alone in this thought.
Slaves were very expensive, especially after independence was gained from Britain. At this point, slavery was, for many owners, unprofitable, but they continued to own them and operate plantations because it was the only way to fund their ongoing payments to banks and other financiers. Because of this, many thought the institution would gradually die on its own. They didn't foresee technological advances like the cotton gin, which would drastically increase the productivity of slaves.
We shouldn't judge this lack of foresight too harshly.
It's like blaming someone in 2007 for thinking the iPhone was just a gimmick, and that using the internet on your phone wouldn't catch on. Well, the people who did were wrong about the direction of the economy and technology, but that doesn't make them stupid or immoral. It just makes them wrong.
Now here's the thing, I am very well that for some of you watching this, no amount of primary source evidence is going to change your mind on this.
At the end of the day, the Constitution did allow for the continuation of slavery for another 78 years. But on the other hand, the Articles of Confederation would have allowed it to go on indefinitely. And there's no guarantee that had the British defeated the American Revolution, that they would have abolished slavery either. By the time they did in the 1830s, slavery wasn't widely practiced in their remaining colonies, so abolishing it wasn't a big deal. But if they had retained control of the American South, that's a different story. For most people, I think the question of whether the Constitution is or was a pro-slavery document has more to do with their perception of America today, and whether the existence of the United States has been a net good for humanity or a detriment. If you believe America's existence has been a positive for the world, then the compromises made around slavery, although tragic, were ultimately worth it. But if you don't, if you think America is and has always been a malignant force in the world, then no amount of evidence is going to change your mind.
I personally think that the world is better off for the United States having existed. Now, that's just me. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Thanks for staying to the end of the video. If you want some more history content right away, then I suggest checking out this video's sponsor, History Hit. Check out the top link in the description or in the pinned comment below, and use the code CasualHistorian to get 50% off your first 3 months. That's the code CasualHistorian to get 50% off your first 3 months. I'd also like to thank my patrons for helping make this video possible. Their support allows me to put more time into topics that I think will be interesting and aren't as covered as much, rather than chasing the algorithm. Thanks for watching the video, and I will see you next time.